So right now, I want to introduce to you guys our summer intern, Kevin Acosta, or Frank, or Frank. As Patrick and some of the girls here were talking about, they went to this training 2 weeks ago, and our youth thought his name was Frank. So they kept on calling him Frank. He doesn't look like a Frank to me. He looks like a Kevin. But, yeah. So Kevin is with us for the summer. He is our summer intern. After this, he's going to go get his master's in divinity. He's going to be able to master divine. That joke got me. Yes, so he's with us for the summer, and one of the things that Kevin is doing here is that he is preaching a 6-long series on the Bible. That's it, on Christianity. And if you haven't seen it on our social media, it's called Christianity Explained. And all Kevin is doing is breaking down Christianity for you. If you don't have an idea what Christianity is, if you don't know anything about it, or if you know someone that is interested but doesn't know much, watch this series because it's great. It's every Monday and Thursdays at 8 p.m. on YouTube. We go live. You can watch it later if you want. But that's what we have, and he's doing a great job. This past week was our first one. We talked about the Bible and the Trinity. So if you want to learn more about what the Bible is, if you can actually trust the Bible, who the Trinity is, who the Trinity and the Godhead is, and why do we have 3 gods and one if you don't understand that, check out Christianity Explained on our YouTube page. He's doing a great job. And yeah, give a hand of applause to Kevin.
Thank you. Yes, my name is Kevin, my birth name. But this weekend I picked up Frank. Yeah, one of the girls was like, yeah, you look like Frank. And she was like, and the other one was like, yeah, especially with that beard. And I was like, what? It's like, what did Frank do to you? The way she said it. So I shaved. I got a haircut. Do I look like Frank now? Hopefully I look like a Kevin, a Brandon at least, not Frank. Yeah, or Keith. Some other guy called me Keith. But no, my real name is Kevin, but you can pick whichever one. It doesn't bother me. So today we're talking about self-harm and suicide. And it's a pretty hefty topic, but I think it's a really important one. And it's one that's kind of important to me because I don't know if you guys were here last week. We had, Benson, who did an amazing job, and Link kind of talked to us a little bit about depression and anxiety, something that a lot of us deal with. Well, I am one of those people, although except I did not deal with anxiety. I'm not necessarily an anxious person, not unreasonably anxious, but I have dealt with depression pretty badly ever since 6th grade. I remember the first time that I was like, something's wrong with me. I was on my way to church, and I got out of the car, and I used to love going to church as a kid. I was pretty involved, and I had a lot of friends, so, I liked it. So I get out of the car, and I'm walking towards church, and I'm like, man, I don't want to be here right now. Like, I don't even like these people. I started going off in my head, and I was like, wait a minute, this isn't me. This isn't me. Something's wrong. And that was the first time. That's when I realized, okay, there's something off here. And by the time that I got to 8th grade, I was an 8th grader, it got so bad that I was contemplating taking my life. And so that's a real struggle, and that's why I'm really glad we're doing this series for anyone else that might be dealing with that out there. And I'm going to open up about that because maybe you're going through it, and you don't want anyone to know or whatnot, but know that you're not alone. You're definitely not alone. Jesus is there, and not only is Jesus there, we're there too. This church is here. That's why you can join your life groups, man. Yeah, join your life groups. It's not just a shameless plug for life groups. It is a real thing. Build a community. The people that got me through it, besides God, was my friends. And so build your community. But I'll tell you about that night. I was in 8th grade. It was halfway through 8th grade, and I'm sitting in my bed, and I can't sleep. And I had been having this struggle for about a week before this, and I haven't gotten any sleep. So I can't sleep. I'm sitting in my bed, and I'm like, oh my goodness, this has got to end. This has got to end. What is going on? And so I get this intrusive thought in my mind, and it says, Kev, you should just kill yourself, just like that. That's it. It's just like that. You're laying in bed, and it comes. It's like, man, you got to kill yourself. You got to kill yourself. You got to kill yourself. And now, look, I went to public school. Public school can be pretty brutal. I'm sure private school can be pretty brutal too, but I don't know about that, so I'm not going to talk on that. But I know that public school can be brutal, and people. I was fortunately never really bullied, but people make a lot of jokes about killing themselves or whatever. And this was not a joke. This was a very distinct difference. In my mind, I was like, I need to do this. And it got worse and worse. And in my head, I'm like, no, I can't do it. Kevin, this is crazy. I'm fighting within myself to not do this. And, I'm fighting for my life. And it gets worse and it gets worse. Finally, about 3 a.m, I'm like, all right, you know what? This is too much. I'm going to do it. So I get up and I go to the kitchen and I pick up a knife. It's a big fat knife, and I was like, man, this is gonna hurt, but it's got to get this over with. So I'm about to do it, and I hear this big voice in my head just like, stop. It says stop, and it's as if someone literally spoke to me, said stop. So I had the knife here, and I was like, okay, and it said, all right, put the knife down, go to the computer. Sure. So, and I got nothing else to live for, so I put it down and I go to the computer. And it says, go to YouTube. All right, go to YouTube. And then it says, type in When Peace Like a River. Do any of you know that song? I never knew that song before then. I'd never heard it in my life. And it said, When Peace Like a River. I was like, okay. So I write down When Peace Like a River. I play it, and I start to calm down. And then I hear, okay, you should pray now. So I'm like, okay. So I start praying. I start praying and praying and praying. And eventually I get up, and I'm like, I just scream out. I'm like, this is happening in my living room at like 3 a.m. I don't know how any of my family did not hear me. Maybe they did, and they just they just kind of like, we're gonna leave them alone. But I got up, and I go like, okay. In the name of Jesus, leave me alone. And I fell asleep like a baby. I'm here today. I'm going to go learn how to read crystal balls, according to Link here in a couple months. Man, God is real. God is real. He is powerful. And that's not to say that I didn't struggle with depression after that. Yeah, I definitely did. But I came out of that a new person, with new faith. And I remember a little time after that, when it got bad again, I was crying, and I was like, man, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to read the Bible. Now, there's a thing that people like to do, and it's that you open the Bible to a random page. You point at a verse and you read it. I do not recommend that you do that. There are many verses in the Bible that can be a little misleading. But I think that God works with us where we're at. And so I think at that time, God was like, okay, he really needs this. And so I opened the Bible, I just point at a verse, and the verse that comes to mind, I put it up there. You guys can throw it up if you want so that they can read it. It's from Isaiah 43:4. And it says, since you are precious and honored in my sight, and because I love you, I will give people in exchange for you, nations in exchange for your life. And again, I went to sleep like a baby right after that. It's one of these moments when you're like, yeah, there's definitely someone out there watching out for me. And that's why I don't know if any of you are dealing with something like that, and if you are, I encourage you, please reach out. Reach out to whoever you think could help you. If you don't want professional help, at least reach out to a family member, something, and more importantly, turn to God. Turn to God, and He will guide you to the help that you need. it reminds me of the story of Lazarus. And if you guys want to do that, go ahead and read John. Let's go to the book of John chapter 11. And this is when Jesus gets the news about his friend Lazarus. His friend Lazarus died. And so he decides to head over and talk and see what he can do about this. I think that Jesus already had it in mind that he would resurrect Lazarus. And this is something interesting. You guys remember that Jesus had this plan. Jesus had a plan. He said, when he went over there, he said, I'm going to raise Lazarus from the dead. And yet, this is what happens. When he gets there, skipping a little ahead, we're starting in verse 32. He says, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, Mary is the sister of Lazarus, for those of you who don't know. She fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And I think that's a pretty accurate reflection of how we are with God sometimes. And I don't think that it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a natural thing that we lash out at God. If you had been here, if you had done this, if you had said this, if you had done this miracle, then this would not have happened. And sometimes we don't realize that God has a plan. God is going to do something about it. But we lash out anyways. And yet, and this is where it's important to keep in mind, that Jesus already knew what he was going to do. But even though he knew that Lazarus would be alive again, verse 33 says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And verse 35, the shortest verse in the Bible, Jesus wept. Jesus, the life of the world, Jesus, the one who knew Lazarus was going to be alive again, Jesus, who had the power to create 500 Lazaruses if he wanted to, wept. And he wept. He wept with them. Why did he weep? He wept because he saw how they were feeling. And I think that's a big statement as to the God that we have. Instead, Jesus weeps with us. And he knows the miracle that he's going to do for you. The Bible says that he knows the plans that he has for you. But he still weeps with you. When you're feeling sad, when you're feeling down, he's still there for you. He's there and he's crying at your side. And I don't know if you guys know how the story ends, but yeah, he brings Lazarus back to life. And everyone has a great party. And I think that's just the perfect analogy for somebody who's thinking about maybe suicide or self-harm. When you get to that point, having been there personally, you lose hope. You have no hope. Once you're at that point, it's because you don't believe that things will get better. And some might even say, I've heard this from other people who say, I'm here right now, but I don't feel alive. But Jesus can bring you back to life. That's the problem, that death doesn't end. Death is not the finish line for him. Death is not a limiting factor. Death is something that he can reverse. And so if you're feeling that way, if you're feeling suicidal, if you're feeling like you have nothing else in your life, if you feel right now that you are a living carcass, know that Jesus Christ can bring you back to life. He can literally bring you back from the dead. It is never, ever, ever too late. Jesus can bring you back from the dead. And so now that we kind of talked a little bit about that, I want to bring up my friend Jenny. She's going to be our mental health expert today. And she's going to, give her a round of applause. Yeah, she's going to be talking to us a little bit about suicide and self-harm.
Man, it's really bright up here. Hello, everyone. This is how the spotlight feels like, my God.
It's a little warm up here, isn't it?
I should have been here for the anxiety topic.
Well, it's good. It's good to have you, Jenny.
Good to be here.
Yeah. Tell us a little bit about your last name. I remember we had fun with that first time we talked.
I recently got married. Well, I've been married for over a year. I recently changed my last name to Alexandre. And a lot of people have a hard time saying it. So we go from Alexander to Alexandre, but it's Alexandre.
Yeah,
There it is.
The first time we talked, I was like Alexandra.
It took us 5 minutes to get it.
Alexandre.
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 There it is.
It's a beautiful name, though. It is.
Thank
But
you.
yeah,
My
okay.
husband seems to think so. I miss my maiden name.
What was your maiden name?
Sylvia's.
Sylvia's.
See?
Oh.
So easy, right?
Yeah, I
Right?
know.
I
Yeah.
tried to tell him, but he was adamant about me changing it.
Yeah. All right. Well, it's a pleasure to have you, Miss Sylvius or Alexandre.
Thank you.
And well, let's hop into it. So, I think it's important to start off with some statistics. We have some statistics about self-harm. We're going to start with self-harm. We're going to talk about that, what that means, the implications of that, and then we're going to move over to suicide. And then we'll have a conclusion to tie both of those up. So let's go ahead and pull up those statistics if you guys can. You can go ahead and talk about them.
So about 17% of people will self-harm during their lifetime. So we may think that's a small number, but when we compare to how many people are actually here, 17% can be a great amount, right? The age of onset, that means the age where people are more likely to start self-harming is at around that teenage year, those 13 years old, you'll start seeing that self-harm behavior will happen. And about 45% of people who self-harm, they cut. So there are we'll get into the different types of self-harm, but most people will cut. A lot of people will cut, and a lot of times you'll notice some cuts in different places in their arms. So those are some pretty large statistics for self-harming.
Yeah, definitely. I know that self-harm tends to be associated with cutting, but I'm pretty certain, especially having talked with you, that self-harm kind of involves a little more than just cutting. So what exactly is self-harm, the real definition of self-harm?
So the real definition of self-harm is deliberately causing pain or damage to your own body. So making a choice that I'm going to hurt my body. Now, this can be intended with suicidal thoughts or not intended with suicidal thoughts, right? And so that can be different types of self-harm that we talked about is cutting, but it can also be burning, biting, hitting your head on the wall, right? I had an experience of meeting someone who constantly would bang their head on the wall, reopening wounds, right? So if you got a wound in your arm and you're continuously picking on it and never letting it heal, taking harmful substances, not necessarily to commit suicide, but substances that are not healthy for you. So for example, swallowing pens or pencils, or to create a certain level of discomfort for you as self-harm, or even taking substances that are not good for you. They might not necessarily kill you, but you know that they're going to create certain harm for you, or some different types of self-harm.
Yeah, and is this, is self-harm limited to physical things? Is it possible to be a person who self-harms, I guess maybe in a more emotional way? Do you think that is a real possibility?
Well, that's a very good question, right? So when we're talking about the direct definition of self-harm, it's inflicting pain on your body. Now, do we have people that will continue to engage in unhealthy habits? Yes. I wouldn't define that as self-harm, but more so emotional harm of putting themselves in situations where they're continuously being hurt, and that could be to many different reasons. But when we're talking about specifically self-harm, it is that pain caused to your body.
Okay, yeah. And I think one of the biggest questions I've had about self-harm over the past is why anybody would do that, right? I think there's a certain, as sad as it is, there's a certain logic to think, well, I can see why someone might want to end their life because it ends the pain. But, a person who self-harms is making more pain for themselves. So, in what you've seen, why do you think people would engage in that?
This can vary from person to person. Is there anyone out there who's a gym goer? No one. Gym goers? All right. So, when you go to the gym, anybody who lifts weights, right? If you're lifting weights and you go really heavy and you feel that pain and you experience that release from that pain you feel. No, just me?
No, definitely.
Right? And it's that release. So creating that physical pain takes your mind off the emotional pain, right? And it's almost a release of pain within. Also, people will self-harm because they lack coping skills. And coping skills are ways we deal with stressors, for example, right? And I know last week you guys touched base a lot on different coping skills, but people who don't know how to deal with things, and self-harm is just a way, all right, I need to find a way to deal with it, so they don't have healthy coping skills, they will self-harm. Other people might self-harm as a sense of punishment to themselves. Whether it's they feeling guilty for something they did and they feel like they deserve the pain. And sometimes the physical pain is a lot easier to take than the emotional pain. Because you know what? At least I can see it concrete, right? Emotional pain, we experience it, but we can't really touch it. But this physical pain, this physical scar, I can see it. It's right there, and I can turn my focus into that physical pain. So I'm not thinking about the emotion.
Yeah, that certainly makes a lot of sense. From some experience that I've had with some of the people who I've known that self-harm, they mention that it's a way of control. What are your thoughts on that?
That is huge. I'm so glad that you brought that up. A lot of things that are happening around us, sometimes it feels as if we don't have control. But you know what? If I can create harm to my body, I can control that. It's a false sense of control. And here's why I say it's a false sense of control. Because you can cut in the wrong place. That's the danger in that, right? And so because it's like I have this false sense of control, this is one area of my life I'm in charge of. I'm in charge of how many cuts I have. I'm in charge of where I have it. And I'm even in charge of how much pain I feel instead of how much pain someone else inflicts on me, right? And you can see that a lot with people who've experienced some trauma, where trauma has been inflicted on them. They don't have control over that. But you know what? I can control what I do to myself. And so that's where that comes from. So that's a very good point.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if this question makes too much sense, but I was wondering, since you mentioned trauma, is there any type of trauma or any certain type of thing that might cause someone to be more at risk for self-harm than others, or is that just across the board?
It's not very specific, so it's hard to say this specific trauma causes this person to self-harm, right? It's not really across the board, because what might be considered trauma for me might not be trauma for someone else, right? And so it's hard to pinpoint and say this trauma creates more self-harm behavior, or this person is more likely to engage in self-harm because they went through this specific type of trauma. Does that make sense a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. And on that note, we can talk about some of the warning signs for self-harm. And I think this is getting a little more practical for any of us that, maybe we want to keep our eyes open for anyone around us that might need some help. So what do you think are some of the warning signs, some of the biggest ones?
Some of the things that I've noticed is fresh cuts. So usually people will have layers of cuts in different places, like scars. Either they have a history of cutting or they're currently cutting. Paying attention to fresh cuts. So someone is constantly having new cuts in their body or new wounds in their body, and it's frequent, right? That can also be a warning sign, where a huge warning sign is wearing long sleeve everything in this Miami heat summer. And I'm talking about being outside. Now, I'm not talking about being in here, because it's cold, you're wearing a jacket, but you're outside and you're wearing a long sleeve all the time. And we're looking at the consistency of it. And so that I'm like, why are you constantly wearing long sleeves, right? People who are very impulsive and have poor coping skills can also be like a warning sign of, hey, what's going on? You're not really knowing how to cope with things. Carrying sharp objects often, it's kind of like, hey, why do you have this in your hand all the time? Like, there's no use for this. And so those are kind of things. Now, it's not a guarantee across the board, but these are some things that I would look for if I'm meeting with somebody and how they're presenting to me. Those are some things that might kind of raise some flags for me a little bit.
Right. And before we move on to what to do when you find someone like that, I was wondering, are there any sort of perhaps misconceptions that people might have about someone that engages in self-harm or maybe the idea?
So some misconception is that everyone who self-harms has suicidal thoughts. Mm. That's not necessarily true. Although there may be related, but that's not necessarily true. As we talked about, there are different reasons why people self-harm. Or people who self-harm automatically, and I'm going to use this word and I'll explain later, have personality disorders, right? Or an access to. That's not necessarily true. And personality disorders can be very difficult people. Although there's a history, I see somebody head nodding, he knows what I'm talking about. My fellow clinician in there, right? And that's not necessarily true. Not everyone who automatically self-harm has a personality disorder. It may be, again, some of those things that we talked about. They have difficulty coping. They're pretty impulsive. They haven't figured out a new way. They're trying to release some sort of pain. And also, people who self-harm will always self-harm, right? We got to be careful in using always. It doesn't always happen. There's no other way for them to cope. This is what they're always going to do. That's not necessarily true, right? Because it's a behavior that they learn, and it's a behavior that we can work on changing that.
Right. Yeah, definitely. I think that always self-harm one is a big one, especially, in my experience, you hear that a lot from people. It's like, oh, they cut, so, they're going to go cut or whatnot, and that's a big one. I'm sorry,
and another one is it's attention seeking, and that happens a lot, and that's not also necessarily true. Now, do some people self-harm to attention seek? Yeah, that falls into more of those personality disorders we're talking about, but that's a misconception that people, they're just wanting attention again. Here we go, right? That's not necessarily true as well.
Yeah. I think that's especially that one. That you hear that one a lot. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, they just want attention. They just want this. Yeah. But if any of us run into someone that might be engaging in that sort of behavior, what are your suggestions about that? What should we do about that?
Well, the first thing is don't freak out. Parents, don't freak out. Don't yell. Don't go crazy. Don't berserk. That might be the first inclination to, oh my God, what are you doing? Then I take you to church. Let's not do that. Approach the situation as calm as you can. And my biggest suggestion is seek help. Seek professional help. Because 1, you don't know how long it's been. 2, you don't know how deep they're cutting, right? And 3, you may not really know how to approach the person. So when I say seek professional help, in conjunction, professional will work with you. Now I'm talking for parents here, right? And my role is I do a lot of trauma work with teens, and I work with the parents. My role is always get the parent involved, right? You are going to have to be involved. By being involved, I mean, I'm going to ask you to check regularly for cuts. And I let the teens know, hey, mom is going to check you regularly for cuts. Pay attention to how fresh the cuts are, how new they are. Take away access to things that they can harm themselves. So, and I let my teens know, mom is going to be searching your room, and they're going to take away the object, anything that you can harm yourself with. Why? Because we're here to help. And it's not approached in an invasive way. And that's why I say seek help and does do family counseling in order to look at how this is going to happen. Because for a teen, that can be pretty invasive. But it is a safety risk, right? Also, be open to listen. And that's a huge one, because a lot of times we're not wanting to listen, we just want solution. It's not a quick fix, right? Look at the frequency of how they're cutting. If, let's say they used to cut every day, and now they're cutting once a month, believe it or not, that's progress. Now, that might not seem like it, but it is. Why? Because the frequency of it is decreasing. Also, work on teaching healthy coping skills, right? Okay, you're self-harming. What is something else that we can do? And all of this is in conjunction with working with a therapist to figure it out. To figure it out with you, to figure it out with a teen, to come up with what we call a safety plan and how to do this. And if it becomes where it's your concern and you're noticing that it's becoming more frequent, I would even go as far as crisis stabilization. Because what can happen is, again, you can cut in the wrong place, right? And I would go as far as crisis stabilization to kind of bring them to a certain level so that they can have some clarity, and then let's revisit those things.
Yeah, and just before we move on, I just, for some of the people like me in the audience, a little more layman, what exactly do you mean by crisis stabilization?
Yes, that is getting them to the hospital for mental health, right? And so we have the ER we take them to the ER and have them evaluated and see if they're at risk at that point to hurting themselves, where they will do a hold. They will hold the person for a little bit, get them calm, get them out of the crisis mode, right? Because once this level of, and we're talking about the level of cutting is intense and it's fresh and it's constant, that there needs to be some heavier monitoring, right? Because you can't keep your eyes, as much as we want to, we can't keep our eyes on them 24/7. And there's a certain level and severity that it gets. They need to be monitored closely to where it doesn't go to that next step. So we're decreasing the crisis. So that's why we call it crisis stabilization, because we're reducing the crisis. Doesn't mean the problem is solved and it's fixed, but at least it's stable so that we can attack it deeper and there's no risk per se.
Right, right, definitely. Yeah, thank you for that. I think we can, now that we're kind of talking about crisis stabilization and that sort of thing, I think we can move on to suicide. And moving over there, I think there are a couple definitions to go through with suicide. So go ahead.
All right, this is a pretty heavy, I know we're touching base on a lot of heavy topics here, and some people may be triggered. Some things may come up for you. I'm going to make myself available afterwards to do that as we're continuing to tackle this, because these are really heavy topics. So I'm going to make myself available afterwards so that we can continue. When we talk about suicide, and thank you for sharing your story, because it's powerful to share that, because not many people share it and they hold it in. And when we talk suicide, it starts with ideation. as you talked about, right? Suicide ideation is that intrusive thought that you get, this nonstop preoccupation, constant, hey, you probably should kill yourself. Hey, no one's going to miss you. These things that are running in your head are suicidal ideation. Then it can proceed to the attempt, right? The attempt is the act. So for you, if you don't mind, is going to the kitchen and grabbing the knife. That starts the attempt for it, right? And the committing of the suicide is the death of being self-directed, injurious behavior. So it's when I'm trying not to use the word complete, but it's when you have completed suicide, and that's the part. So there's suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, and actually committing suicide. And the goal is to work and to catch it at the suicide ideation, right? Because some people can attempt, but not actually commit.
Right,
Yeah.
Definitely. And when we're looking at somebody who might attempt suicide or is in the process of ideation, what are some of the risk factors that might lead to that?
So I like to talk a lot about risk factors, and risk factors are things that are more detrimental, that puts, I don't like to use the word disadvantage, but that puts someone at more of a greater risk, right? So having a previous attempt, so that's why I like to go into the definition of attempt is not necessarily committing suicide, right? That previous attempt, and why that can be a risk factor is because now there might be a guilt associated to the fact that you've attempted, and probably your family already knows that you've attempted. And so now that guilt is, a thought of someone like that might look like, you couldn't even do that right? And so that's why that's also a huge risk factor. Previous attempt. Mental illness such as depression is a huge risk. And when we talk about that feeling of hopelessness, that it's just not going to get better. I can't function on a day-to-day basis, right? And that is a huge risk. Substance abuse, right? Being stuck in that cycle of addiction is huge because you just want it to stop. You just want it to stop. And the only way it can stop is if I probably end my life, right? Financial issues. I'm probably going to age myself, but I don't know if anybody remember when the market crashed not too long ago. Not this recently, but the first time. There was a high rate of suicide where millionaires, billionaires, these guys were jumping out of buildings because they had lost everything that they had. And experiencing that heavy loss is a huge burden. So having serious financial issues, again, we're looking at it at the thought is, I'm never going to get out of this, right? And we talk about isolation. I like to define isolation as the silent killer. And why is isolation such a high risk is because no one is there to intervene. No one is there to know. And that's kind of almost part of the disease is that I don't want to be around anybody, so I'm going to take myself away from everybody. And now you're alone with just you and your thoughts. No one is there. No friends, no family, no one. And you're isolating yourself. You're isolating yourself from the things you used to do. You're isolating yourself from your job. You're isolating yourself from school. You're isolating yourself. And that puts it at a higher risk because no one can notice these signs if you're by yourself, right? How can I pick up on something when I don't see it? Trauma, and we can go long history into that. Series of trauma is also huge risk. And undealt trauma, right? Trauma that hasn't been dealt with is a huge risk factor. Family history of suicide. Having a family member in the past that has committed suicide. Now you're dealing with the guilt, right? And so we go deeper into these feelings Now you're dealing with the guilt. I had a family member who committed their suicide, and I couldn't do anything about it. And now I'm contemplating suicide. Maybe that's my way out, right? And then we can look even into like looking at depression and mental illness. There's a family history there. And we've kind of already touched base on that. That hopelessness is, it's just not going to get any better. And those thoughts are very intrusive when you are stuck in a situation that A, you feel like you have no control over, and B, it just really is not going to get any better. There's no way, there's nothing you can tell me to make me feel like this is going to get better, because this is where I'm at right now, and nothing has changed. And probably even looking at things in the past that has created this level of hopelessness, because things really did not get better. And that's where I believe, having Christ is so important, because he gives us that hope. He gives us that hope that we don't have. If we're looking at it within ourselves, yeah, this world sucks. But if we look at him, then we have hope in him. We have hope in something else other than our situation,
Amen. Definitely. And I know that there's perhaps one more definition, just so people know. We have protective factors. What is a protective factor? And kind of go through what you think they should be.
Protective factors are things that I love to talk about, right? And these are things that are in place to help us. These are the things that, there's nothing that we did. It's just, these are things that are in place that are here to protect us. So learning how to cope is huge. Learning how to solve problems is huge. Why? Because it doesn't allow you to continue into this cycle of it doesn't get better. Because here's what you're going to do if you know how to cope. All right, I'm going to figure out how to solve it. I'm going to try to come up with a solution, right? And these are huge protective factors. Is someone who's able to solve problems, who's able to cope. Yes, they're feeling down, but you know what? I'm going to get up here and I'm going to say, and I'm going to feel closer to God, and finding ways to deal and manage emotions. And these are things that I tell people, you have to do these things every day, not just when you're feeling down. You have to build that muscle daily, because when you are feeling down, that's when you use it. So having a hobby, doing something that you like to do, watching a movie, journaling, whatever it is, create that habit of coping skill for it, right? Cultural and religious belief. And this is one sometimes that's why I'm really grateful that I am a Christian therapist, and I advocate that, because it plays a huge part into someone's views of life, right? It plays a huge part on how we see our situation. As Christian, yeah, we know weeping may endure for a night, but guess what? Joy comes in the morning, and that plays a huge part. It's a huge protective factor that when I get a client who's Christian, man, I jump on that, because you know what? We can go to the Word. We can look at those promises that God has made us. We can challenge our thoughts with those words. It's one of my favorite coping skill things to do, is to challenge our thoughts, because it comes with that intrusive thoughts. How can we challenge our thoughts with the promises and the belief that Christ has given us? Man, it's so powerful to do, and we see that. And we see that, as you mentioned, even Christ wept, but he overcame. And when we look at that example, it helps us know, you know what? I may not have hope, but someone else has hope. So religion and faith and Christianity is a huge, huge, huge protective factor, as well as connection to friends and family. And earlier I talked about isolation. If you look at the risk factors and you look at the protective factors, it's almost as if they're like solutions to each other, right? Isolation pulls you away from your friends and family. But here we have a protective factor that says, hey, the closer you are to your friends and family, the more you feel connected. We were not created to be alone. We were created to be in community so that we can have things like this, so that we can have these discussions, so that you can share your testimony and let somebody know, hey, I'm not alone. There's power in knowing that you are not alone. There's power in community. There's power in friends. There's power in family that are upholding you and supporting you. Nothing like when you're in a depressive mood and your friend come over, pulls up the blind and says, what are we doing today? And I'm like, I'm sleeping. They're like, no, you're not. You slept yesterday. We're going out today. As much as you don't want to do it, but having that person that checks in on you, that, hey, you know what? If I'm feeling down, I know I can pick up the phone and somebody's going to be at the end of the line to talk to me. And that's also important, right? Having access to mental health services. And this is also important because as much as, friends, family, all these things are important, we also need that professional help, right? We also need that additional cherry on top, I like to call it, of having access to mental health and not creating a stigma for mental health, to where we can create a safe space for someone to be able to say, hey, I'm feeling suicidal. Hey, I'm thinking about cutting myself. Hey, I'm having these feelings and I need a safe space. So giving them access to have the services. And lastly, one thing I want to touch base on is not having a lethal means among someone who's at risk. What do I mean? If someone is suicidal, don't have a gun in the house. And that's actually one of the things that we check for. All right, I'm having those suicidal thoughts. Great. Do you have a plan? No. Do you have a gun at the house? Yes. We got to get rid of it. Why? Because you have an easy access of doing it. And when that thought overcomes you, the easier it becomes, or do you have pills, right, that you can take? How high is your building? Do you stay in the 15-story building? All right, maybe you should probably stay at a friend's house that's on the first floor. So reducing the lethal ways that someone can actually complete the task, because we got to help them along the way, are some, few protective factors that are important.
Yeah. It reminds me of a time I had a friend who was going through that in college, and I had to drive to their house and take their gun. Yeah, everything you're saying just really resonates. Especially what you mentioned before about creating a habit of problem solving. That's such a big thing, because having been in a situation like this, when someone is deeply depressed, you don't want to problem solve. That's the problem with depression, that it takes away your desire to problem solve, which is why I've had many friends who say, I don't need God because, I have myself, and, religion is for, weak people. But the problem, and I think something that they're misunderstanding, is that when you're in a situation of, depression, you are not a reliable source. You are no longer reliable. You are actively working against yourself. And so having that habit of leaning on people, leaning on God, and problem solving goes a very long way. That is definitely something that resonated with me. So let's move on to warning signs. What are some of the warning signs that we should look out for?
Now, this is not across the board for everyone. One of the things I want to point out is look for a change in behavior. And that can look very different for many different people, right? So, for example, someone who is usually pretty flat. It's not an abnormal thing for them to be just pretty flat, pretty chill, right? Keep to themselves. That's not an abnormal. That's not outside of who they are. All of a sudden, there's a spike of energy that happens, right? And it's completely opposite of who they are. That's a warning sign to me. And here's why. Because what goes up must come down, right? And that's when we talk about that manic phase where they're all over the place and they're jumping and they're making hasty decisions and they're jumping in front of cars. That's a risk, right? And so looking at that immediate shift and change in behavior, paying attention to language that looks as if it's final. And people don't straight out say, oh, I want to kill myself. But they'll say things like, I'm tired of it all. I just wish this would end. I have no way of dealing with this anymore, right? So you're looking at that at language that describes finality. When people start selling everything that they have with no plans of getting anything else, that's concerning for me, right? You're getting rid of everything one by, and that is also very, very concerning. An increased use of drug and alcohol, right? And even if they, especially if they're not in addiction, all of a sudden they're coping with this negative substance, because what that does is, one, and once you're in the state of depression, your mind is already at the negative standpoint, but you're adding a substance that's altering your mind even more. And so that can create an even more impulsive response to what's happening. Talking about being a burden to others. Oh man, I just wish I wasn't such a burden to my mom, such a burden to my friends. They don't like me. You know what? If I'm not here, their life would be better, right? Words like that. I'm like, what do you mean by that, right? And feeling like, talking about how they feel trapped. Again, it talks about that finality. There's no way out. Oh, I feel trapped. I feel like I'm living the same miserable life over and over and over and over, and I just need it to stop, right? That's not usually, oh, I want to kill myself. It's just language like that we want to pay attention to and ask for clarification. And, I'll say, well, what do you mean by that? Oh, I just wanted to stop. Are you thinking about killing yourself? Right? Because people are very hesitant. They don't want to come out and say it because it's a heavy thing to come out and say, hey, I want to kill myself. But they'll say things around it. And then when people are starting to write good notes, right? They're starting to write, hey, it was great, these goodbye notes, these long notes of confession, and they're doing that, especially if they do have a history of depression. That's also a sign for me to look deeper into what's going on.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. What you had said a little bit ago, it made me think of one of the misconceptions that we had talked about, suicide. Go ahead and talk about some of the misconceptions we might have about approaching this situation.
One of the misconceptions we might have is people who commit suicide are selfish. And that's not necessarily true. From the outside looking in, we may think, how can you be so selfish and do this? But in reality, when we talk about their thought of, I'm a burden to you, in their mind, they're releasing you from the pain of them, right? And that is a huge misconception that we have, is that people who commit suicide are selfish. And also, not everyone who commits suicide has a mental health diagnosis. And we talked earlier about some of the risk factor is financial issues, right? Experiencing a huge dip in financial. A lot of those guys, they didn't have mental health issues. They had an unfortunate life circumstance. They had poor coping skills and acted immediately on that, right? And these are some of the few misconceptions we have. Just because somebody committed suicide didn't mean they were suffering from depression. And another one is that once you've committed suicide, you're always going to have the thought of suicide. That's not true, right? That's not true. You can overcome it. You can reject the thought. You can be better, and you can live a life free from the burden of suicidal thoughts and ideation, right?
Yeah. I believe that's definitely very true. So now I guess we can move on to what we should do when we run into someone. Maybe someone's expressed this sort of idea. Maybe we just have a suspicion. What do you think we should do?
One, always take it seriously. Always take it seriously. Don't think, oh, they're just joking, right? Always take it seriously. And earlier you talked about how in public schools, teens have a tendency to joke about that. And I'll clearly tell my teens, this is not a joke. Saying you want to kill yourself is not a joke. It's a serious thing. And so when somebody says, I am thinking about killing myself, take it seriously. Get them help as soon as possible, right? And take away any access that they have. So if you're with them, like you mentioned, you have to drive and take your friend's gun away. Take away that access and get them help. Call the police if you're not able to kind of get to them to take them to the hospital. I'll call the police. When you call the police, please ask for the crisis unit. Miami has, I don't know about other counties, but I do know specifically for Miami, they have specific police officers that are trained to deal with this. And here's why this is so important. With that training is so important, how police officers deal with individuals' mental health, because then you could have suicide by the police. And that's not what we want. We want the police officers to go in there and to provide them the help and support. So if you do have to call the police and say, hey, there's someone here who's thinking about, killing himself, can we please have the crisis unit come over? And they do a really, really good job with the experiences that I've had of dealing with that. And I think I've kind of touched base on that. Take them away from the harm immediately and take it seriously, because it is a serious issue.
Yeah, definitely. I believe it is a very serious issue, and I think that's one of the important things. I think we, as people, we do a very bad job of taking it seriously sometimes. Sometimes we hear someone say something, we're like, well, I don't want to jump on it because maybe, it'll make it worse, or maybe it's just awkward. But I think jumping in is definitely something we should do.
Well, I think about it this way. I'd rather be wrong, right? I'd rather be wrong about that, because you know what? I'm sorry, I'm wrong, but you're alive, right? And I like to joke about this a lot, but it's not a joke, but it's just, in that moment, you can pray for the person. But just pray on it. Don't dismiss it with prayer, right? Take active plan. And I always use this example. If your friend calls you and says, hey, I just broke my arm, are you going to say, hey, just pray on it, I'll catch you later? What's going to be your suggestion to them? Where are you going to tell them? Where? Go to the hospital. You're not just going to say pray on it. You're going to tell them to do something. You're going to encourage them to do something about it. And it's the same thing. When we have someone call us, we have to be careful. Now, internally, always pray. I'm always in prayer when meeting with my clients. I'm always in prayer. I always pray for them. But we have to begin to be a lot more practical in the way that we address certain things and not just dismiss it with, oh, well, God's going to fix it. He is. Through help, through support. Just like he provided doctors to help you with your arm, right? He also provided clinician to help you with the deeper things that you are going through. Yeah. And, and also asking, another misconception that I didn't bring up is asking someone about whether or not they want to kill themselves is not going to get them to think about killing themselves. Chances are they're probably already thinking about it before you even ask them. And you asking them could have just saved their life. Because here's what happens. Whoa, someone cares about me and is paying attention to me. There's that hope, right? There's that hope. So a lot of times people are afraid to ask someone about whether or not they're thinking about killing themselves, and especially if they're not being very direct, go ahead and ask. And it's a very uncomfortable thing because a lot of times people don't know how to deal with the answer because they're like, oh my God, if I ask, am I going to get him to kill himself? Like, what do I do if he says yes, right? Well, if he says yes, okay, let's call the police. Let's get you some help, right? You're going to ask, okay, what do you think? How do you plan on killing yourself, right? So we talked about ideation. Do you have a plan? How do you plan on killing yourself? I don't know. I thought about just walking into traffic. Okay, well, I think you might need to get some help, and I'm going to help you, right? And at that point, I'm calling the police. No, please don't call the police. Please don't do this. I want to make sure you're safe. And right now what you're saying to me is concerning. And call the police and ask for a crisis unit and let them handle it. And they will do a further assessment into whether or not they need to take him in.
Yeah. Here we have some resources for anybody who might know somebody who needs this, or you might need it yourself. We left some of the ones from last week up there because we felt like those are still good, because if you're going through depression or something like that, you are at risk. So please go ahead and look at those. But we also added some. If we go to the next slide, we also have some of these networks that she had wanted to mention.
So the previous ones are great for in-the-moment, high-risk crisis. And when I mean crisis, I mean it's happening right away and you need some immediate help. And those are important. But there needs to be a follow-up, right? And we have some community resources. Agape Network is a Christian resource, is a Christian network that is used. Chrysalis, Benyon Health System is available. I don't know if you had Alliance up there.
No,
there's a couple of others. Alliance Psychological Services, Crown Wellness, also is Christian. It's run by one of my good friends, Natalie. You guys will get a chance to meet her next week. She also provides services. I also provide services if anybody needs, or if you need referrals or contact to connect, please reach out. So these are ongoing therapeutic services. I believe they also offer psychiatric services for those who need medication. So again, we have Agape, Chrysalis, Benyon, Alliance, and Crown Wellness are some great resources as well.
Yeah, and since we had mentioned that one of the big factors in all of these is this idea of hopelessness, we have some scriptures up here just for, to give you hope, to let you know that the Bible is here for you, God is here for you, and the church is here for you. The church is the body of Christ. And if Christ was there for those who needed help, we need to be there for our members, and not even just our members, anybody who approaches or that we see that needs help, we should be there too. So if you guys can pull up some of those scriptures for us, that would be nice. We have Philippians 4:12-13. This is one that we often use for I can pass school or whatever, but I think this has greater implications. It says, I know how to live on almost nothing or with everything. I have learned the secret of living in every situation, whether it is with a full stomach or empty, with plenty or little. Verse 13, and here comes the big whammy, for I can do everything through Christ who strengthens me.
How did you know that was my favorite verse?
The Holy Spirit spoke to me.
Wow.
The verse is not talking about going through school. The verse is talking about dealing with the burdens of life. And as a matter of fact, it's great that you're a clinician and you love this verse, because in the Greek, verse 13, it's not really saying you can do everything. It's saying you can bear everything. Yep. You can bear. We can endure everything through Christ who strengthens us. We have another one up there. We wait in hope for the Lord, for He is our shield. And I don't know if you want to talk about any of these.
Yeah, this is a really great one. Why? Because it talks about that hope. And as I've mentioned earlier, that feeling of hopelessness is within our doing. Like, I can't do this. That's right, you can't. But you can with Christ, right? And once we remove self out of the equation and we put our hope in something, in someone other than us, it's not me that's doing this, but it's Christ in me that is giving me this hope. It is Christ that is being my shield, right? And Christ is the number one protective factor because he shields us. As much as we think life is hitting us, as much as we think things are hard, think about how much harder it would be if Christ wasn't our shield. And I think about that a lot, you know, when we're feeling down. And that's why I talked about building a habit when you are not feeling down, to fill yourself up with the word so that it becomes second nature when you're feeling down. Because trust me, when you're feeling down, you're not going to want to look at your Bible. You're only going to try to remember the things that you've already filled yourself up with. And if you've already filled yourself up with the word, with Christ, right? And it can help you challenge some of those negative thoughts of, man, this is not going to get any better. You can say, no, that's not true. Because I know I have hope in someone who's going to make it better, right? Oh man, I can't do this on my own. I can't do this. I can't. And I hear a lot of words. I can't. I'm tired. That's okay. Because through Christ, you can do all things, right? And it's creating the habit of filling ourselves up day to day so that when you do get to that tough situation, you'll already have it in your back pocket.
Amen. Amen to that. Everybody, give a big round of applause for Jenny Alexandra. I'm sorry, we didn't get to talk about this, but you had mentioned before that you offer services. What do you do? What did you study?
I give wonderful talks like these in amazing churches like this. It's actually one of my passions is to do this. But right now I work at a homeless shelter, and I do a lot of trauma work with teens and kids and families. I am trained in trauma work and also behavioral. And so that's one of the big areas of where I do work on and see those high-risk clients and high-risk behaviors and providing those services for them.
Yeah, well, again, thank you so much for your time. I guess we'll have the worship team come on up, and let's end it out with some worship.
Right, and if anyone was triggered or anything came up for you, please see me. I'll make myself available if you want to just touch base for a little bit. You guys have a blessed Sabbath.
Stand up, church, and listen. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and your children, and their children, and their children. May his favor be upon you and 1,000 generations, and your family, and their children, and their children, and their children. May his presence go before you, and behind you, and beside you, and around you, and within in the morning, in the evening, in the coming, in the going. You're weeping and rejoicing. He is for you. 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 He is for
Everybody, let's have a quick word of prayer and then we can dismiss. Dear God, thank you so much for being there. Not only are you the great physician, you are the great clinician, and we thank you so much for that. We thank you because you're willing to weep beside us, even though our problems are probably nothing in comparison to the universe. But you are there with us when we need it most, when we're in our darkest moments. You are there, and you understand. And so we thank you for the sacrifice of your Son, that we can be saved, that we can have hope, and that no matter how dark it is, we can always know that there is light at the end of the tunnel. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, everybody. So they'll go ahead and keep jamming here, but you guys are welcome to stay, or you can go home and eat. Thank you for coming.